11:32. I think I will allow this as our basis tonight, Daniel 11:32. We've already gone through the second invasion now of Egypt by Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, the king of the north. The second invasion, after both the first and the second, he vented his anger against the Jews because he was not really successful in conquering the Ptolemies in Egypt, and Palestine was on the way home. And so he would vent his wrath and his displeasure and basically his discouragement and disappointment over not being successful against Egypt, against those in his way or on his path, and that would be the Jews in Palestine. The middle of verse 30, he'll have indignation because he's grieved. He'll have indignation against the Holy Covenant. And verse 31, they'll pollute the sanctuary, take away daily sacrifice. Sacrifice is added, but that's what was daily, so it's a good addition. And they shall place the abomination of desolations. Remember, we studied last week. Or they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Where? Well, they'll put that in the holy place. It has something to do with the pagan image set up on the altar there. So we are down to 168 B.C. You see, we're almost through with all of the material in Daniel 11. We won't be through with the intertestamental period, of course. We won't even be through with the political aspect of the intertestamental. We still have to look at the religious and the social aspect of the period as well. And furthermore, we won't even be through with the Maccabean period, just because we get through with Daniel 11 and verse 35. That's as far as we can go as the 35th verse. 36 gets into evidently material that refers to Antichrist, which wouldn't refer specifically to Epiphanes. Verse 35 would end that section from 21 through 35 of Antiochus Epiphanes. But we'll still have a lot of material because that, well, it doesn't really, unless you kind of want to stretch it as just being general material, it doesn't even go down to the end of the period of Judas Maccabeus, the first of the sons that takes over after the death of the father. We know that evidently because there's no mentioning of the rededication of the temple anywhere in those verses 33, 34, and 35. Although that's really not the point of the prophecy, and I feel that even if we're going to extend the prophecy past, let's say, December of 165, it would be allowed, because the point of the prophecy is to predict the persecution through which they'd go, not the victory of reestablishing worship and reestablishing sacrifice in the Lord's temple. But be that as it may, I think we'll be there a week or so and we'll explain that to you. We're down to 168. As a matter of fact, we even know the month from the records, from Josephus and Maccabees and other records. We know that we're down to December. We're down to December of 168 B.C. by the time we're into the end of verse 31. And I think you'll probably need your chart sooner or later tonight as well. So we've got three things. He will pollute the sanctuary of strength. He'll take away the daily sacrifice, which was very important to Israel, and he would set up the abomination of desolation, spoken of in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 and 1 Maccabees chapter 1. And we looked at those passages last time, I believe. Now let's get into verse 32. I think we'll confine ourselves with verse 32 because it is a literal prediction of the Maccabees. And although a whole lot happens, we'll just cover the initial stages of the Maccabean Revolt in tonight's teaching. We'll look at the continued Jewish resistance next week, Lord willing, and we'll just build upon that for the next few messages until we can conclude this section of the Jewish intertestamental period history. Now, in verse 32, it's set up in such a way that we've got a clear-fold distinction between two classes of people in Israel. They're Jews, but two classes of Jews, we could say, a twofold division of the people of Israel that's seen during the persecutions of Epiphanes. We've got those that are anti-law of Moses and the Orthodox way, and then obviously would have just the reverse of that, the Orthodox among the Jewish people. Let's read the verse, and then we'll get into this and look at some verses in the books of Maccabees that correspond. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. Now, this is speaking of one group of people in Israel, one group of the Jews there. And such as do wickedly against the covenant. Now, without reading past that, we could think, well, these could be Syrians here. Or some form of Gentile people. They would certainly be ones that were doing something wicked against the covenant. But it goes on to say that these who do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. He is a reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. Shall he corrupt by flatteries? Well, there'd be no need to corrupt fellow Syrians or other Gentiles there. This must definitely speak of the renegade Jews. They're called renegades in the books of Maccabees. Sometimes they're called the lawless ones. Or we could just give them, for sake of a better title, the apostates in Israel, those who've given up the ways of their forefathers and given up the teaching of Moses. And therefore, we see that Epiphanes is going to work in Israel. Remember, he's very clever. He's not one who just comes in by military might. He's very clever. He's going to try to divide the people, divide them over not politics or military, but divide them over the question of state religion in Israel. Divide them over the question of obeying the law of Moses. And he's going to be quite successful. We'll see this even more in the books of Maccabees. Dividing the people, thereby ending up with a group of apostates that also we could refer to as the Hellenists, those who are adopting the Greek way of life, Greek customs, Greek philosophy, and along with that would come Greek religion as well. At least it would be a watering down of the true precepts and statutes and the laws of Moses. So this would be the first group, the apostate Hellenists. But they're Jews now. They're not Gentiles or Greeks. They are Jews. These are the ones who do wickedly against the covenant. How? By surrendering the precepts of Moses' law and just falling by means of these corruptions and guile and flattery right after the heels of Epiphanes. And then we've got a second group. But, see, it's an important but here. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. This would refer to the Orthodox Jews, not just to the Maccabees as such, but the Maccabee family, or really the Hasmonean family happens to be the most important in the group. But it would refer to all of those in Israel who were orthodox in their beliefs and who maintained the law of Moses. So basically that's why we have this verse, to set in one verse, although it's been intimated before that, such as the end of verse 30, we mentioned last time that Epiphanes would have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. Well, he couldn't be speaking of a Gentile. They never had the Holy Covenant. It would have to speak of the Jews here surrendering the Holy Covenant. So I've said it's already intimated earlier, but we have to wait until verse 32 to get a clear full distinction between the Hellenists and the Orthodox Jews. Those that sin against the covenant, those that, because they're obeying the covenant, are strong in the Lord and do exploits. Okay, let's go over to the books of Maccabees and build a little here. First of all, let's look at the Hellenists. If you want to have A and B, we'll look at the Hellenists, and then we'll look at the Orthodox Jews. Some references to the Hellenists, apostate Jews, a few references to those that remain Orthodox. Okay, this is an earlier time period. We've already covered these verses, but we'll mention them for sake of completeness. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. And I will read this section again, although it does come earlier. We're back about 174. In these verses, 174 B.C. 1 Maccabees 1, verses 11 through 15. Are you catching on to how intimately you have to know the books of Maccabees? Because they're not always in a whole lot of order. But I think I can guarantee you that by the time we're through over the next, month or so with these teachings, you'll have, at least in your notes, whether you know it or not is beside the point, you'll have it available, every single verse in any of the books of Maccabees, these two books here, and how it parallels the history of the Jews. And where those that do parallel the 11th chapter of Daniel. Not all do. The entire book of 2nd Maccabees, at least towards the end, you remember the first part goes back earlier, back to Seleucus IV, but all the way to the end parallels Daniel. And in 1st Maccabees, it's only up to the death, really, of Judas, which is around chapter 9, verse 21 or 22, somewhere around there. But anyway, let's read this again to show you the nature of what's going on. This is earlier, 174, but it happens in 168 as well. In other words, it's an ongoing state policy as far as the Syrians are concerned, to divide the people over the question of their religion. At that time, there appeared in Israel a group of renegade Jews. See, I told you they were called renegades. When we run across that term, renegade, or the lawless ones, then he doesn't mean the Gentiles who are without law, but the Jews who have forsaken the law. Who incited the people, let us enter into a covenant with the Gentiles round about us, they said, because disaster has overtaken us. And the people thought this was a good argument. In other words, if you can't beat them, join them then. And we'll just join our oppressors, and that will make well for us. And hence you've got Daniel 11:30, the end of the verse, and verse 32:8. People thought this was a good argument, and some of them, in their enthusiasm, went to the king, Epiphanes, and received authority to introduce non-Jewish laws and customs. Now, who's doing that? The Jews are, introducing non-Jewish laws and customs. They built a sports stadium in the Gentile style in Jerusalem. Greek specifically, Gentile as a whole, but Greek specifically, where, of course, they'd have to exercise in the nude. They removed their marks of circumcision, repudiated the Holy Covenant, they intermarried with Gentiles, and abandoned themselves to evil ways. Okay, then verses 42 and 43. Now we're down into 168. Once we pass verse 29, we're into 168. How do we know that? Well, because we know verse 20 is talking about first invasion in 170, and then verse 29 talks about 2 years later, which would have to be 168. Verse 42, the king issued a decree throughout his empire, and his subjects were all to become one people and abandon their laws and religion. The nations everywhere complied with the royal command, and many in Israel accepted the foreign worship, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. Hellenistic Jews in the country. Then verses 51 and 52. Such was the decree which the king issued to all his subjects. He appointed superintendents over all the people and instructed the towns of Judea to offer sacrifice town by town. And look at this verse. People thronged to their side in large numbers, every one of them a traitor to the law. They're called traitors. And then over in 2nd Maccabees, chapter 5 and verse 15. Not satisfied with this, the king had the audacity to enter the holiest temple on earth, guided by Menelaus. And who's Menelaus? He's the high priest. He's the Jewish high priest. So the chief renegade and apostate and lawless one of them all would be the high priest, the one who is supposed to be the custodian of the Jewish religion, who had turned traitor both to his religion and his country. So Epiphanes has been fairly successful, according to the books of Maccabees, in drawing away by flattery and guile and subtlety and deception, and maybe some promise of reward or peace, a large section of the Jewish contingency here in the land of Palestine. But he's not totally successful. I think it's somewhere back in 1 Kings 18. God always has his faithful people reserved somewhere. You may think you're the only one. Sometimes it feels like you're the only one. But God told Elijah, nope, there's 6,999 others besides you. Or 6,998 others besides you and Obadiah. 1 Maccabees chapter 1 and verse 53 for some of the Orthodox Jews. Now we just read verses 51 and 52. 1 Maccabees 1, now verse 53. For a look at the Orthodox Jews. We just read about how people thronged to their side in large numbers, every one of them a traitor to the law. But look at verse 53. Their wicked conduct throughout the land drove Israel, that is faithful, elect Israel, drove Israel into hiding in every possible place of refuge. Now we're going to study that a lot more over the next few weeks, just exactly what's happening here in verse 53. That's just a summation of the author of the book of what he's going to elaborate upon for the next many chapters. Their wicked conduct throughout the land drove Israel into hiding in every possible place of refuge. And then I think we've mentioned some of the persecution in verses 60 and 61. In accordance with the royal decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised. Now you see, that was an important religious rite for Israel. Many people in the United States do that today for male children, but it doesn't have religious significance to it. But it did for Israel. Their babies, their families, and those who had circumcised them, they hanged by the neck. Yet, many in Israel found strength. This verse is almost a direct parallel to Daniel 11:32. They that know their God shall be what? Strong. Yet many in Israel found strength. Now remember, first Maccabees, both the events and the writing of the book take place hundreds of years after the events and the writing of the book of Daniel. Specifically Daniel 11:32, the verse that's under consideration tonight. Yet many in Israel found strength to resist, taking a determined stand against eating any unclean food. They welcomed death rather than defile themselves and profane the holy covenant, and so many of them died. Then 2 Maccabees chapter 5 again, and verse 27. So we're trying to point out very minute. There's no way you can keep up unless you've got a computer out there in your seat beside you, punching in all these verses. But I know, because I've had to work it all up at home, I know when we're skipping over one because that half of that verse is reserved for a message 2 weeks from now or something. And we are covering all of them if you just go back and put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Chapter 5, verse 27. But Judas, also called Maccabeus, with about 9 others, escaped into the desert. We just read over there in chapter 1 that they went into hiding in places of refuge. Well, here's a case of it, where he and his companions lived in the mountains, fending for themselves like wild animals. They remained there living on what vegetation they found so as to have no share in the pollution. 2 Maccabees 5:27. So here's what we have going on. Immediately after the abomination of desolation is set up in 168, then Israel enters into an immense period of persecution such as she's never experienced prior to that time. And it was of such an extreme nature that the scriptures seem to imply that it was to serve as a type for the horrors through which she will yet go in the period commonly referred to as the tribulation. Let's look at a few passages that speak of Israel in the tribulation. And keep these in mind in light of what we read last week, and we'll look at tonight, and we'll continue to look at the horrors of the Epiphanes persecution. That was to be a type. In no manner is it on the same scale as what Israel is going to experience, but it is to be a type of what she will experience. Remember, if Epiphanes, the persecutor of Israel, is a type of Antichrist, the great final persecutor of Israel, then so would the persecutions under Epiphanes be a type of those under Antichrist. So just a few verses, again, for completeness' sake. I don't like to leave anything out. That's why we take so many years to finish one series around here. Jeremiah 30 and verse 7. Jeremiah 30 and verse 7. These are a few scattered ones. Now, they're everywhere, but a few scattered references to Israel's persecution. Not speaking of the church now, we're speaking of Israel during the tribulation period. And you see, our whole understanding, we won't ever have to do this again. Well, I didn't get any amens because you're probably turning. We won't ever have to do this again to Daniel 11, to go through step by step by step and look at all of this. But whenever we get one of these days to studying the tribulation, and Israel's persecution, we can just refer back to all of this. And you'll have to have some understanding of what's going on here. And that's one way we know. People wonder, well, how do we know? Isn't Israel going to be delivered, before the tribulation period comes here? Well, this is one way we know she's not going to be, that Israel is going to be here, because the whole type is pictured in the book of Daniel. That just like Epiphany serves as a type of Antichrist, so his persecutions, those of Antichrist in the future. Alas, for the day is great, so that none is like it, none even including those under Epiphanies. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob's trouble, Israel's trouble. But he shall be saved out of it. That is, preserved through it, remember, not delivered from it, but preserved through it. Jeremiah 30 and verse 7. And here in our book, Daniel 9, verses 26 and 27, although 27 really would be the only thing that relates to that. We'll get the context. So you can put 26 and 27 and underline 27. After 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. That's the AD 70 sack of the city by Titus, the Roman general, the city of Jerusalem. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, this is Antichrist, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. It's going to be wrath and fury poured out upon them. Chapter 7 and verse 25. Oh, we need this verse now. Well, we're going to see some in the New Testament that say the same thing. But take a look at Daniel 7 and verse 25. I can tell I'm wound up again, so I hope we get through in an hour tonight. Sometimes you're not wound up, sometimes you are. He shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. Well, he's not speaking of Christians here. He's speaking of Israel. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a times, and the dividing of a time. See, a lot of people stumble over a verse like that because all they think of as a Christian is a saint. But a saint's really a bad translation, because by saint we think of Saint Nicholas or Saint Thomas or Saint Jude or Saint someone like that. Or if you don't think of that, you think, well, Christians are saints. Well, it just means the holy ones or the holy people. They are God's holy people. And of course, Christians are holy people as well, but we're back in the Old Testament, not in the New. Zechariah chapter 14, the first 3 verses, that even the non-premillennialists have a problem with. Zechariah 14. It doesn't fit or post-millennialism, but it does fit premillennialism. Behold the day, if you don't know what that means, forget it. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Sounds like a pretty bad time. I think I said recently that's the time you don't want to be taking your trip over to Israel. So check with your tour guide before you go, and ask her, does she know if tribulation is going to begin anytime soon? Half of the city will go forth into captivity. Well, maybe it'd be in the other half. The residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight. Well, verse 2 speaks of a period of tremendous, tremendous tribulation. And then Jesus' Olivet Discourse, the 24th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses 21 and following. Matthew 24 and verse 21. Then shall be great tribulation. We read part of this last time. Verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, let him that readeth understand it, then let those flee. He says in verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. Not since the beginning of the world. to this time. See, I just have said tonight that the period we're talking about, 168 BC, that the persecutions Israel experienced then were persecutions that she had never experienced not until that time. But there's going to be persecutions in the future yet that will be greater than that. Those serve only as a time. No, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, that is, the elect Israelites, those days shall be shortened. And if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here's Christ, or there, believe it not, false Christs will arise, false prophets show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect, that is, the elect Jews, but it will not be possible. And then in Revelation chapter 13, here's the verse, I think the one I'm looking for, that corresponds with Daniel 7:25. Revelation 13 and verse 7. Revelation 13:7, it was given unto Antichrist to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. What do we read? That power was given to Antichrist to overcome the saints. So we know that he's going to be successful in overcoming them. So all of this is typified in our studies of the books of Maccabees and here in Daniel chapter 11. So to know something about Daniel chapter 11 and the books of Maccabees is to get yourself going along the way to know something about Israel's persecution in the future. Now you might want to notice again 1 Maccabees 1 verses 60 and 61, which speak of the period of persecution beginning in 168, continuing on down into 166, 1 Maccabees 1, 60 to 61. And some of these persecutions, women put to death, their children, their babies, their families, all of these hanged by the neck, all of these put to death. These events of persecution, some of these, are seen over in 2 Maccabees, chapter 6 and chapter 7. 2 Maccabees, chapters 6 and 7. But since I don't feel that the events of those chapters are really described in Daniel's chronology in the order of verses, we're trying to study them verse by verse. Since I don't really feel that that's covered, 2 Maccabees chapter 6 and 7 until, let's see, verse 33, Daniel 11:33, then I think we'll wait until next week or the next week and we'll actually take a look at those chapters in 2 Maccabees. Remember to have Maccabees along with you, particularly the next few weeks, because we've got whole large sections. I want to just spend the time in reading them, and it will be helpful if you'll have the books along so you can read along with us. Okay, to refocus our attention, back in Daniel 11 and verse 32. Now, this second half of the verse would be a great comforting prophecy to those Jews in the 2nd century BC. Because they realize that there is a possibility of being strengthened by God to revolt against the Syrians. Daniel 11:32b. Now, a word or two on that before moving on. While there are other promises in the Word of God, such as in the New Testament, there are other promises for the Christian's strength and well-being and overcoming ability by the Holy Spirit. While that exists over in the New Testament, Daniel 11:32b, technically and in the literal sense of the word, has only to do with the family known as the Maccabees and those that came under the protective wings of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC. I guess in principle form, you could say, well, we're just drawing by principle form from this verse. The people that know their God will be strong and do exploits, because is that not true of Christians? Well, it is. But your verses of substantiation would be in the New Covenant and not in the Old. I have heard of this verse used, and that must be where I picked it up from. I've heard it used by other charismatics as a great faith promise for charismatic Christians. Daniel 11:32b. The people that know their God will be strong and do exploits. And I'm always curious, why? I know just the literal thing that's being said, but I'm always curious to wonder, to think about, to know why or how, I guess would be a better question. Did the charismatic ever come up with this? Well, I've got a good solution. Someone was doing their daily Bible reading because they wanted to be able to tell others, I read from Genesis 1:1 all the way to Revelation 22:21. And you had to read Daniel 11, and it was the most boring passage, maybe besides Chronicles, you'd ever read before. You didn't know what all this meant. And then you saw this verse, those that know their God will be strong and do exploits. I mean, sure, that's how someone found it. You didn't just say, I just know it's there, the faith promise in Daniel 11. You were reading the chapter, and it was so boring to you. You were looking for something to grab hold. You know that old humanistic spirit we've been talking about? You were looking for something to grab hold to and say, I've got my promise for today. Now I feel satisfied reading Daniel 11. I didn't understand that kings of the north and south. But I want to do some exploits, have some Holy Ghost unction and power. So here it is, Daniel 11:32. Well, I dare say that, I guess only God really knows in the world today, looking down, knowing who is the first individual that found that verse over in Daniel 11. It wasn't me. I wasn't doing my daily Bible reading and found it there. I must have heard someone else say it. But I think that's probably as good a guess as any on how someone ever came up with Daniel 11:32.
For the continuation of this message, please.
That's probably as good a guess as any on how someone ever came up with Daniel 11:32, which shows that old spirit of humanism sticking its corrupting head up again. They were bored stiff reading Daniel 11. Thought it was the worst chapter in the Bible, all this king of the north and king of the south. None of it applies to me. Everybody's always getting beat up, it looks like, so nothing applies to me until, look at verse 32, those that know their God will be strong and do exploits. Well, they probably got so happy they didn't read the next three verses, because the next three say those that were strong and knew their God and did exploits, they also died a martyr's death. They never read that far. So we're going to be looking at tonight and the next few weeks the tremendous, tremendous struggles that the Maccabees went through against the Syrians. And I don't think that I've met any charismatics that have gone through the struggles that the Maccabees went through. So I don't even know if they could really claim a verse like this for themselves, because they certainly haven't demonstrated it. And if you do, you're asking for an early death, like being skinned alive and then your body thrown in a boiling pot. We'll read about that sooner or later. That's what they got, because look, the next verse. They that understand among the people will instruct many, yet they'll fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil. Those that knew their God. He's talking about the same group of people are going to fall. And they fall again in verse 35 as well. So back to that old problem of incorrect Bible interpretation. Okay, having settled that, Daniel 11:32, although if you want to think of it in light of Christianity, then I guess you could take a promise from it in principle form. At least we're now educated to the historical background for Daniel 11:32b. But what's remarkable to me that in no sense of the word are we stretching the matter to say this is a literal prophecy of the people known as the Maccabees. We're not just saying, well, I wonder who this applies to. There's no question about that. There's no way to get around that. Whenever you study Daniel 11 like we've done, it's inevitable that you'll end up with the conclusion that these books that we just have studied now in the past year, in outline form anyway, in biblical literature, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, are very, very important to know. It's almost like you don't have a prophecy here that the books are going to be written, but there's such a remarkable connection that a Christian could hardly afford not to have the 2 books of Maccabees on his library shelf at home because of Daniel 11:32. You could hardly afford not to have them there. Who are these people? The people that know their God will be strong and do exploits. Well, we're going to show you the Maccabees, and they were strong. And what's interesting, well, I'll save that for later. They did do exploits, but I'll save the fact that they knew God for later. Moving along, this persecution lasts for 2 years, from 168 down to 166. tremendous state persecution by the Syrian overlords of the Jewish people. And during this period, we have sporadic outbursts of Jewish revolt against the Syrians, but it's only sporadic. It's not until evidently sometime early in the year 166 BC that we have the first official organized revolt of the Jews against the Syrians. And the leader of the first organized Jewish resistance movement was one Mattathias. Mattathias, just like it sounds, Mattathias, and his boys, his sons. They became known in history as the Maccabees, which I'm sure you can spell, or you can look at your book of Maccabees and find out. They became known in history as the Maccabees. And it's my contention, and it's the contention of anyone who knows the Maccabean history in Daniel 11, that Daniel 11:32b and following, but particularly that verse because it sums it up from the positive side of it. That is a literal prediction of the family of the Maccabees. And then by association, it includes those that came under the protective wings of the Maccabees. The Maccabees were the leaders, but one man and a couple of sons couldn't defeat the Syrians. But they could be the leaders and attract huge numbers in Israel and fight what we call today a guerrilla-type warfare and be very, very successful in that. This story unfolds in the entire second chapter of 1 Maccabees. Which chapter it appears from looking at the time tonight. We're going to have time to read the entire thing later on. We're going to clear up some other things first of all, and then we'll have time to read the entire second chapter of 1 Maccabees. That would be verses 1 through 70. Well, we're all familiar with this name Maccabees. Let's do a study of that name, of that term. What in the world does that mean? What is the origin of that term? The Maccabees. There are various suggestions of what this term means, tracing its etymology back to various origins. I think we would have to begin with saying that according to 1 Maccabees 2 verses 2 through 5, each of the 5 sons of Mattathias went by both a given name and a nickname. Now, this is our first step in uncovering the mystery of the origin of this term, the Maccabees. In other words, it doesn't really correspond to, the Smiths or the Rosses or the Joneses. It doesn't correspond like that. This is a nickname. Maccabees is a nickname. Each of the 5 sons of Mattathias, they're listed for us in verses 2 through 5 of 1 Maccabees 2, had a nickname. And the nickname of one of the sons, Judas, was Maccabeus. Singular Maccabeus, plural Maccabees. Who evidently was not the firstborn. He's oftentimes made out in lay Bible studies as the oldest of the boys of Mattathias. But he's evidently not the firstborn. Evidently he's the thirdborn, because his name is mentioned third. He's got 2 other brothers beside himself that come later. The term also appears in 2 Maccabees 5:27 and 2 Maccabees 8:1, where Judas is called Judas Maccabeus. That was his own personal private nickname. Now, there are a couple of theories concerning the origin of the name. Let's look at some theories. First of all, the origin of the term Maccabee. First of all, there's the theory that this name, Maccabee, came from taking the initial letters of the Hebrew sentence of Exodus 15:11. that it came from taking the initial letters from the Hebrew sentence of Exodus 15:11. I don't have my Hebrew Bible up here, so I'll look it up in the English. I think we know what it says, but you couldn't get anything out of the English. You'd have to read your Hebrew Bible to look for some M's and some C's and some B's there. At least get your consonants involved. Exodus 15:11, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Part of the praise in the Song of Moses, Exodus 15:11. Why do they hold to this? Because some scholars say that this was the battle emblem on the banners carried by the Maccabees. And the scripture was back to the law of Moses. But I don't know that any evidence for that has really been found, though. It's just been hypothesized. And I don't know of too many people that hold to that theory. So there's the theory. Well, let's trace the etymology just of the term Maccabee. Instead of looking at it as an acronym, let's study it in its Hebrew context. And another theory then would say that the term Maccabee or Maccabeus comes from the Hebrew word for hammer. H-A-M-M-E-R, a hammer. So that what the name meant was Judas the Hammer. Judas the Hammer. It's like the name that Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, had in the 8th century A.D. He was known as the Hammer as well, Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. So they would then explain the origin of this name, first of all, from this term hammer, and then they would say it's based on the victories. Maccabeus, Judas was so successful in his revolt against the Syrians that he just hammered away at the Syrians. And as a result, he was given this name, Maccabeus. That's a possibility. If that's true, then 1 Maccabees 2 and verse 4 is written retrospectively and not prospectively, because he's not fought any battles, and his nickname is Judas Maccabeus. Well, what makes that difficult is that all the other sons' nicknames would have to be given retrospectively too. That they somehow got that later on, and now he's looking back, adding in their nicknames. So that doesn't appear to be a good option if you're following our line of thought. It appears like before the battle was ever begun, he was known as Judas Maccabeus. So probably a better explanation would be that this was a nickname based on an earlier vocation that Judas had, and that, of course, would be a carpenter. He probably was a carpenter as a teenager, or however old. We don't know how old he was. But teenager in his 20s and his 30s or whatever, he was by trade a carpenter, and therefore known as Judas the Hammer. You could do a study of each of the other sons' nicknames, but I trust you see that's not important at all for what we're looking at. We're only talking about the Maccabees, and we're trying to uncover the etymology of this term, Maccabee. So that's good to know. They weren't named as a family, the Maccabees, like Mr. and Mrs. John Maccabee, and then Judas Maccabee was their son. No, this happened to be a nickname of the third-born son that was given long before the Syrian battles even began. He was known as Judas the Hammer, or Judas Maccabeus, because he was a carpenter by trade. More technically, they were known as the Hasmoneans. If you look at your chart, I think this is the name you're given there, and that's really the correct name. Maccabees is the popular term. We still use that today because it's been popularized in the title of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. But more correctly, after all, that's just a nickname, because when you say Maccabee, you think of a family name, Mr. and Mrs. Maccabee and all the Maccabee sons. And that gives you a distorted view of the origin of the term there. But if you look, we're under around 150 BC. You find 150 on your chart. The first word under that is Hasmonean. Hasmonean. That is a family name, and that's the technically correct name. That was the name of the great-grandfather of the father of the sons. Therefore, it was the great-great-grandfather of Judas Maccabeus. The name of the great-grandfather of Mattathias was Hasmon. 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 and because he evidently was such an outstanding early religious figure in the family. Mattathias was too, and Judas became that. But the family derived its name as a group of people from the great-great-grandfather of Judas Maccabeus, and his name was Hasmon, Hasmon. So what are we going to refer to them as? Probably, I think I've done both over the course of the history, and probably will continue both, but we'll stay with Maccabees because it's become so popular. But just let it be known that that technically is not the name of the family. Their name is the Hasmonean family. We refer to them by the name Maccabees because of the popularization of the term in the title of the two books. And because Judas happens to be one of the most famous and most well-known in the family of the Hasmoneans, and his nickname was Maccabeus. The Hasmonean period, you see it begins there in 166. We're not going to be back to our chart for probably a little while. You need to kind of be familiar where we are. And maybe we better pause and look at that real quickly. If you look under, let's say, 170 BC, look down and you find the name Menelaus and Jason. Then look under that and you've got writing written up the page, and you see 169, Antiochus captures Jerusalem. Okay, then you see 168, December, pollution of the temple, suspension of daily sacrifice, and the abomination that maketh desolate. That's the other third thing they didn't mention there. 166, the revolt of Mattathias, which is what we're studying now. And if you trace that up, go right out from the end of the name Mattathias, and you go up to a line that has 166 on top of it, that's the beginning of the Hasmonean rule, where it says in dark print, under Jewish rule, Hasmoneans. Remember, they've been under the Ptolemies for over 100 years. Now they've been under the Seleucids for many decades. And although they're not totally independent until 142 BC, at least the Hasmoneans are basically in control of the country. That starts in 166, and that goes all the way down to the time 37 BC. Follow that on your chart as well. Look all the way down to the time of 37. The Hasmonean period extends all the way down to the time of 37 BC. What's important about 37 BC? Do you know besides looking at your chart? Well, if you don't, look at your chart. Herod captures Jerusalem and begins his reign. This is the same Herod that tries to have Christ murdered whenever he is just a baby. Herod the Great. There were many Herods, Herod Antipas, and other Herods that we'll study in this class, as a matter of fact. We'll have to know all of them by name and which one fits in where in the Gospels and the life of the early church. Remember, Herod had James killed and tried to have Peter killed and ended up dying a grievous death over in Acts 12. Well, that couldn't be Herod the Great. He already died a grievous death. And he did die one of the world's most horrible deaths from what we understand from the writings. But 37 BC is an important date to remember. Herod captures Jerusalem and begins the Herodian dynasty that lasts for many years. We even have groups of Jewish renegades known as the Herodians. They're in favor of what's going on there. But we could also give it another end date, although I still would take it to 37. 63 is the other important date, 63 BC. Because Israel stops her independence at this period whenever Pompey conquers Palestine for the Romans. So 63 BC is another date that's important. The conquest by Pompey of the Jewish people for the Romans. Now with the great rise in power of the Hasmoneans, notice on your chart there, we just have this all of these people, all the way down to 37 BC, are descendants from the man Hasmon, from Mattathias, from various of his sons, the Hasmonean people. They become very, very, very important. They become so important, as a matter of fact, and this is something that a lot of people have never thought of, that their importance, evidently, is what tends to obscure the importance of the royal family. What's happened to David? David's family. David's family from the tribe of Judah, and David's family, the most important family, to have the ruler, always to have the ruler. What's become of David's family? Because we're talking about priests here. Mattathias is from the tribe of Levi. Judas and all of these are Levites. They're from the tribe of Levi. What has happened to the important family of David? Well, because of the rise of the Hasmoneans, they have risen so much in popularity and in ecclesiastical and political power that it's tended to just totally obscure the family of David to the point that by the time we open the New Testament, then we have people like Joseph, descended from the royal family of David, and he's nothing but a lowly carpenter, which was not a very good occupation, not a very good position to have. And what put him in such states? A lot of people have never thought of that Joseph was nothing but a carpenter. Jesus himself became nothing but a carpenter, probably because of the rise in popularity of the Hasmoneans. They just obscured the religious aspect of them. It just obscured the importance of the royal family of David, so that by the time of Matthew 1, one of its members is insignificant, Joseph, in the insignificant trade of a carpenter. Okay, that Mattathias was a priest we can prove from the following verses, connecting 1 Maccabees 2:1 with 1 Chronicles 24:7. As a matter of fact, remember there were, 24 courses of priests? He was from course number 1. Mattathias was descended from the first course of the priests, 1 Chronicles 24:7 with 1 Maccabees 2:1. Who had grown old by the time of 1 Maccabees 2 and finally retired. The priests, remember, had to live and to work in Jerusalem, at least while their course was being run. But Mattathias, we know, lives in a town called Modin. Because he lives in Modin, he must have been so old that he had retired from religious performances. Remember, you can do that after age 50, then you're too old to work there, that he's retired from his priestly duties at the temple in Jerusalem. So he has retired to a little town called Modin, just a few miles northwest of Jerusalem. You'll see it spelled one of two ways, either M-O-D-I-N or M-O-D-E-I-N. You'll find it both ways. Modin. He's referred to as Mattathias, the priest of Modin. Now, let us read 1 Maccabees 2. I think you know enough now to better appreciate what we're going to read here in this chapter. Now we're talking about the beginning of 166 B.C. That's an important date in Israel's history. 166 B.C. That's the date for 1 Maccabees 2 and what's going on here. Okay, at this time, read along with me if you can. A certain Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, appeared on the scene. He was a priest of the Jorib family. We just mentioned that, 1 Chronicles 24:7, from Jerusalem, who had settled at Modin. There it's spelled I-N for you. Mattathias had 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. When Mattathias saw the sacrilegious acts committed in Judea and Jerusalem, he said, "Oh, why was I born to see this? The crushing of my people, the ruin of the holy city. They sat idly by when it was surrendered, when the holy place was given up to the alien." Verses 54 and 59 of the preceding chapter. "Her temple is like a man robbed of honor. Its glorious vessels are carried off as spoil. Her infants are slain in the street. Her young men by the sword of the foe. Is there a nation that has not usurped her sovereignty, a people that has not plundered her? She has been stripped of all her adornment, no longer free, but a slave." He has no idea that he's going to fulfill Daniel 11:32b. "Now that we have seen our temple with all its beauty and splendor laid waste and profaned by the Gentiles, why should we live any longer?" So Mattathias and his sons tore their garments, put on sackcloth, and mourned bitterly. See, they're a part of the Orthodox remnant in Israel. The king's officers, who were enforcing apostasy, came to the town of Modin to see that sacrifice was offered. Many Israelites went over to them. Mattathias and his sons stood in the group. The king's officers spoke to Mattathias. "You are a leader here," they said, a man of mark and influence in this town with your sons and brothers at your back. In other words, since you are a leader here, why don't you set the scene and you offer the first pagan sacrifice here? We see what Mattathias does to that old fellow here in a moment. At the mere suggestion of him or anyone else going to offer a sacrifice in his little private religious town. I don't mean that derogatively. He's a good man. You may be the first now to come forward and carry out the king's order. All the nations have done so, as well as the leading men in Judea and the people left in Jerusalem. Sounds like a great apostasy. Then you and your sons will be enrolled among the king's friends. You will all receive high honors, rich rewards of silver and gold, and many further benefits. Although many times, remember Epiphanes promised things and he never gave them. To this, Mattathias replied in a ringing voice. He didn't go away and say this in a closet. Though all the nations within the king's dominions obey him and forsake their ancestral worship, though they have chosen to submit to his commands, yet I and my sons and brothers will follow the covenant of our fathers. Heaven forbid we should ever abandon the law and its statutes. We will not obey the command of the king, nor will we deviate one step from our forms of worship. This is some good material to base your life upon, because he's fulfilling Daniel 11:32b. As soon as he had finished, a Jew stepped forward in full view of all to offer sacrifice on the pagan altar at Modin in obedience to the royal command. The sight stirred Mattathias to indignation. He shook with passion, and in a fury of righteous anger, he rushed forward and slaughtered the traitor on the very altar. This is a fellow Jew, but it's a renegade Jew, a lawless one. At the same time, he killed the officer sent by the king to enforce sacrifice and pulled down the pagan altar. He showed his fervent zeal for the law just as Phinehas had done by killing Zimri, the son of Salu. That's back in Numbers 25. Follow me, he shouted through the town. Every one of you who is zealous for the law and strives to maintain the covenant. He and his sons took to the hills, leaving all their belongings behind in the town. That time many who wanted to maintain their religion and law went down to the wilds to live there. They took their sons, their wives, and their cattle with them, for their miseries were more than they could bear. Word soon reached the king's officers and the forces in Jerusalem, the city of David, that men who had defied the king's order had gone down into hiding places in the wilds. A large body of men went quickly after them and caught up with them and occupied positions opposite. And they prepared to attack them on the Sabbath. There is still time, they shouted. Come out, obey the king's command, and your lives will be spared. We will not come out, the Jews replied. We will not obey the king's command or profane the Sabbath. So without more ado, the attack was launched, and the Israelites did nothing in reply. Why? It was a Sabbath day. They neither hurled stones nor barricaded their caves. Let us all meet death with a clear conscience, they said. We call heaven and earth to testify that there is no justice in this slaughter. So they were attacked and massacred on the Sabbath, men, women, and children, up to 1,000 in all, and their cattle with them. Not any of the Maccabees, but other people that have escaped. Great was the grief of Mattathias and his friends when they heard the news. They said to one another, if we all do as our brothers have done, if we refuse to fight the Gentiles for our lives as well as for our laws and customs, then they will soon wipe us off the face of the earth. So that day they decided that if anyone came to fight against them on the Sabbath, they would fight back, rather than all die as their brothers in the caves had done. It was then that they were joined by a company of the Hasidians. Biblical lit, we talked about the Hasidim, just another name for them, the Hasidim. Stalwarts of Israel, every one of them a volunteer in the cause of the law. Let's go on down to verse 49. The time came for Mattathias to die. And so from verse 49 all the way down through 64, he gives a whole rehearsal here of the great men of the past, and Abraham, Joseph, Phinehas, Joshua, Caleb, David, Elijah, Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, all these faithful people who had trusted God. Verse 61, as generation succeeds generation, follow their example, for no one who trusts in heaven shall ever lack strength. They that know their God shall be what? There's that word again. Strong. Don't fear wicked man's words. So forth. Verse 65. Now here is Simeon, your brother. I know him to be wise in counsel. Always listen to him, for he shall be as a father to you. So he is the spiritual guide as far as wisdom is concerned. Judas Maccabeus has been strong and brave from boyhood. Probably had pounded his thumb a number of times. From boyhood he had been strong. He shall be your commander in the field. So they have a new leader now that Mattathias is going to die. And all this takes place in 166. It's another way why we know and how we know that Mattathias is up in the years. Gather to your side all who observe the law and avenge your people's wrongs. Repay the Gentiles in their own coin, and always heed the law's commands. Then Mattathias blessed them, was gathered to his fathers. He died in the year 166 B.C., was buried by his sons in the family tomb at Modim, and all Israel raised a loud lament for him. Okay, there's an introduction to the Maccabean Revolt, the Maccabean family, and what's popularly referred to as the Maccabean period.